my experience, steroids literally never work. Now that's because if steroids, whenever they do work, that patient doesn't end up coming to see me. But steroids don't actually work all that well for neuropathic itch.
Welcome to the Learn Skin podcast with me, Dr. Raja.
And me, Dr. Hadar, where we discuss all things skin.
Join us as we delve into the art and science of skin health in today's episode.
Hey, Raja, can you say the thing I told you to tell them?
Of course. We are board-certified dermatologists. This podcast is meant for educational and informational purposes only and is not considered medical advice, nor does it serve as a substitute for professional care by a doctor or other qualified medical professional. All opinions shared do not express the views of Learn Health, Inc. Let's get to the good stuff.
Hey, Raja, how are you today?
Hey, Hadar. I've been thinking, have you been getting that itchy feeling lately?
Yeah, I'm really itching to talk about this topic we have today. We see a lot of patients in clinic. They come in and on its surface can be a very frustrating kind of complaint because it sounds very mysterious. They'll say something like, "Doc, I know you're a skin doctor, but I don't have a rash. But man, does it itch." And to the novice dermatologist who just approaches the first time or medical student, this seems like a mystery. How can this be? How can people come to see a dermatologist and they are so itchy, but they don't have much to show for it? But to the seasoned dermatologist, as the one we have today, this is easy peasy. This is one of the best parts of their day. And so I would like to dive into that with permission from you, of course.
Oh my gosh, anything that leads to a lemon squeezy is fair game for us. Well, we are pretty lucky here. We've got an itch expert, and we have Dr. Matthew Zirwas, who's joining us, and he is definitely a seasoned dermatologist. He's out in Columbus, Ohio. He works at Doc's Dermatology, and he's faculty for Ohio University, not the Ohio State University, but I just want to remind everyone, I did go and attend the University of California, Berkeley. So all of us can throw some D's in there, but not Ohio University. Nevertheless, Matt, thank you for joining the podcast. We are itching to talk to you.
I am going to scratch all of those itches. You guys are never going to have felt as good.
Amazing. And Matt, let's start at the beginning, actually, because as I mentioned, it can be a little daunting for dermatologists, even a family practitioner or anyone who interacts with patients at that level who come with this kind of complaint. When they talk about itch, usually we're used to our inclination, I should say, to the average practitioner and average person is to say, okay, show me where it itches. There's got to be something there, right? And if we can't see it, maybe it's a bug there. But we know better. And I think it's really helpful to have a systematic approach to thinking about what could be the causes. So how do you go about asking and kind of going down that algorithm to figure out what kind of itch and how to diagnose this? Because some people are itchy all over, some people it's just like one arm, some people it's the back. How do you organize the history in a way that's useful?
The first thing that I ask people is, where do you itch and when do you itch? And sometimes you'll get the answer, I itch everywhere all the time. And when you get that, the next thing you've got to ask is, so you're saying every single square inch of your body itches every single minute of the day. And then they'll usually then say something like, well, no, like today my back is itchy. Yesterday my thighs were itchy. The day before that it was my shins. The day before that it was my waistline. And if itch moves around, so that we're starting off with the person who says my itch is everywhere all the time, because you really divide itch in a practical sense into three different things, right? Itch with a rash. And that we're not really going to talk about because that's, you figure out what the rash is. You biopsy them, you figure out what's going on, and you treat the underlying dermatosis. And then you get the people who are itchy without any primary rash. Now, there might be a little rash there. There might even be a little spongiosis from them scratching. You might see some excoriation. Sometimes you'll hear, oh, they started these little red itchy bumps. But, you don't see any little itchy red bumps. You just see some excoriations on them. But we're talking today about people who really it's itch with no primary rash. So first you divide it into, is it kind of all over or is it localized? First, talking about the all over itch, does it move around or is it same place all the time? If it moves around, then the first thing I really think about is symptomatic dermographism, which a lot of times my experience is these people don't have much of a positive dermographism test when you scratch them. And you can really only diagnose it by treating them with high dose antihistamines. And this is actually the only role for antihistamines in itch without a rash. That's one of the things I want to get across to people.
Yeah, Matt, I just want for some of our listeners who may not know what dermatographism is, maybe you can just explain that in a sentence.
Yeah, so I explain it the same way I explain it to my patients. So the basic idea, dermographism, right? Dermo, skin, graphism, writing, and it's whenever there's friction on the skin or tightness, so tight clothing, furniture, things like that, where friction triggers mast cell degranulation. And the way you explain that to patients is that mast cells are like these little microscopic water balloons that are in your skin and your nose and your mouth and your eyes. And normally they only pop, but they're water balloons, but they're not filled with water, they're filled with histamine. And people are generally familiar with what histamine is because of antihistamines. And so they're filled with these histamines. And normally you think of it as being, if you get exposed to something you're allergic to, that's like little needles that pop the water balloons. Well, in this person who's got symptomatic dermographism, where it's clothes rubbing, just them touching their skin, again, furniture, things like that, it is that their water balloons are too fragile. And pressure, friction, sometimes even heat, things like that cause the little water balloons to pop, release their
Right.
histamine, often doesn't even release enough histamine to make it, get a welt, but enough to make it itch. And those people I treat with my preferred regimen is fexofenadine, i.e. Allegra, 180 milligram pills, but you take 4 of those in the morning, and that is totally safe, absolutely no side effects. And then you take 2 cetirizine, i.e. Zyrtec, at night, and I see them back in a month, and if they're better, then I've confirmed it's symptomatic dermographism and they stay on the antihistamine. And if they're no better, then we go to the other cause of widespread itch, and it can be, literally it is just all over itch all the time, or it can move around, and that's neuropathic itch. And with neuropathic itch, widespread neuropathic itch, you think of as being a small fiber neuropathy. And we have a few specific agents that actually work pretty well for widespread neuropathic itch. My favorite is mirtazapine. It's an old antidepressant, very well tolerated, very good sleep aid. This is my go-to drug for people who are itchy. And, it's 15 milligrams QHS. It has very few drug interactions, very well tolerated even by elderly patients. And that really is my go to for the itchy patient. I haven't written a prescription for hydroxyzine or doxepin in years. I always go to mirtazapine. And then the other drug that I think most people are familiar with for this situation, of course, is gabapentin. Gabapentin and pregabalin, they both can work pretty well. Main problem I see with them is they're not very well tolerated. By the time patients get to a high enough dose where it helps with their itching, the complaint that I always get is, I feel like a zombie. I feel like a zombie. I don't want to be on this. And so that's my go-to if the mirtazapine doesn't work, but mirtazapine is my first line for the sort of patient who's itchy without a rash.
Well, Matt, thank you for that. And speaking of go-tos, that kind of begs the question. One of the topicals that a lot of people will go to is steroids, whether it's over the counter or if it's a prescription. And I think a lot of it is just, trying to figure out how do we get this itch under control. But I know that with your expertise, can you give us a landscape of where are we with steroids? Why are they used so much? And what are other approaches that are out there?
Yeah, so it is one of those things when people, get to me, I'm usually minimum the second dermatology provider they've seen, often the third or fourth or fifth. And in my experience, steroids literally never work. Now, that's because if steroids, whenever they do work, that patient doesn't end up coming to see me. But steroids don't actually work all that well for neuropathic itch. They occasionally work, and that's probably because certain cytokines, especially IL-13 and IL-31, which are part of the inflammatory cascade, activate itch neurons, or at least make them more sensitive. And the topical steroids may help, but my experience is it's rare. The topical steroids are very helpful whenever there's not much rash. And I will tell you, these patients used to be the bane of my existence, right? The patient with brachioradial pruritus, right? The itchy forearms, or scalp pruritus, or lichen amyloidosis, or notalgia paresthetica. So lichen amyloidosis, neuropathic itch on your shins. Notalgia paresthetica, itchy spot on your back at the tip of your shoulder blade. Those used to just drive me nuts. But there is a new product out there that has really kind of changed my experience and changed my patient's experience. It's called Dermaleave. And this stuff has been absolute game changer for these patients. It really is shocking how well it works. And in my experience is it works in about 70% of patients with neuropathic itch, itch without much rash. It really does make a huge difference. It works in 5 minutes. First time they put it on. Typically, the effect lasts for about 5 hours. And so I do have some patients who end up putting it on 2 or 3 times a day, but they are happy to do so because it gives them so much relief. And fortunately for us, there's no steroid in it. So there's no, don't use it longer than this or might thin your skin. No concerns with anything like that. And it's an over the counter that patients can get on Amazon, or they can get it through the Dermaleave website, right? Dermaleave.com, DERMELEVE.com. And it is a very reasonably priced product. I mean, the company has really done a good job of making this accessible, because a lot of these patients are elderly on fixed income. If it's $60 or something like that, it really becomes something that can be a challenge for them to afford. But Dermaleave has really made it a priority to make this affordable for these patients, and it has really been a game changer.
Matt, thank you for taking us through this. And I just want to clarify for myself and the listeners. So now we were talking about this kind of generalized itch without a rash all over. You mentioned kind of systemic therapy. And now we're talking more about focal itch or local itch. And we're talking about neuropathic itch, a specific type of itch that kind of happens in specific locations. You beautifully explained that. And, when you started with this itch everywhere complaint, I always do the same thing. I kind of break it down with the patients, but I think it really illustrates how much itch is impactful on a patient's life. If you break it down, as you said, it may be that they're just itchy on their legs, but it feels like their entire world is now revolving around this itch, and it feels like everything around them is itchy. I want to ask you about this topical approach to local itch, because why, and it may seem trivial, but why not go with the systemic therapy? What are the advantages of using a topical? Because a lot of patients come to me and there's that patient that, yeah, just doc, just give me a pill. I just don't want to start smearing stuff all over. What could be the advantage of in that patient to say, there's a cream that I think is better in this particular case?
So that is a great question, and what it really comes down to is that even though the mirtazapine and the gabapentin are reasonably safe and well tolerated drugs, anything that is an oral drug has a risk of adverse events. And the mirtazapine, you can rarely get neutropenia associated with it. It does make people sleepy. You can get some morning grogginess with it. It's an antidepressant, so there's some stigma associated with it that you often have to walk through with the patient, that no, you're not. It's not that I think this itch is that you're depressed and you just feel itchy because you're depressed. And it ends up getting into this conversation that could be challenging. It's a conversation that I'm very comfortable having, but that's because I've had it hundreds and hundreds of times. But when we go to an oral drug, there is risk of side effects. Gabapentin and pregabalin really do have some cognitive adverse events, kind of slow down people's thinking, give them a little bit of brain fog. I often see people get lower extremity edema with them. And so they are drugs that I end up going to. So I mentioned that I think that my experience is that the Dermaleave works in about 2/3 of patients. The 1/3 that it doesn't work, my next step is generally going to be one of those systemic drugs. And that kind of goes back to something else that is implied in this conversation. And it's that when we look at the topicals that we've historically had for itch without a rash, so things like pramoxine, menthol, camphor, things like that, it's not that they don't do something, right? They obviously help some people, otherwise they wouldn't have been around for the last 50 years. But patients, by the time they get to us, a lot of them have tried pramoxine. A lot of them have tried the camphor menthol. And while those drugs have some efficacy, it's not great. It really isn't great. And I, to be honest, rarely use those drugs. I do occasionally use some topical diphenhydramine, which we've now learned activates or blocks the TRPV receptor. So it has some benefit in things other than histamine based itch. But there really isn't anything that's even close to the efficacy of Dermaleve for these localized itch patients.
And do you ever use compounding in that sense? Because you mentioned sometimes things don't work. Is it possible to compound a few medications to help? Do you ever go that route if Dermaleve alone, as you mentioned, in your hands works very well, but sometimes you need something extra?
So occasionally, and the most useful compounded thing are some of these lidocaine, amitriptyline, ketamine, things like that in them, combination creams. But my experience with those has not been as good as is reported in the literature. Obviously, they're a little bit harder to get because you got to send them to a compounding pharmacy. They're probably about 4 times as expensive as Dermaleve. So
Right, right.
one of the great parts about Dermaleve, right? So you'd say there's some of those compounded creams. Well, I can get 30 grams for $45. Well, you can get 120 grams of Dermaleve for $32, and it is a very cost effective, and for the efficacy that you get, you really can't beat the price of it. The other part of that is fantastic is that Dermaleve is really good about providing us with samples, and they'll send samples in these little sachets, kind of like little tiny ketchup packets, the kind of thing that like a Miquimod comes in. And you give patients, 2 or 3 of those and tell them, hey, next time you have the itch, try this. It's probably going to work the first time you put it on. If it does, then you'll know it's going to work and it's worth buying the stuff. And if you put it on and it doesn't work, then, this isn't a drug where, oh, you got to use it for, 3 weeks before it works the first time you put it on. So that is another really big benefit of it. You go to dermaleve.com and you hit the contact us and tell them you're a dermatology provider and would like samples. They are more than happy to send them to you.
Now, I wanted to go back to this focal itch cases because one of the issues with topical therapy that can be a challenge to our patients is the location. You mentioned the scalp, which can be sometimes challenging, how to kind of get stuff between the hairs to really reach the skin of the scalp. You mentioned notalgia paresthetica is a itchy spot on the back that is notoriously very difficult to scratch. And I bet you have many stories, like many other dermatologists, about the various tools and methods and kind of ways people bend their back just to hit the spot. Any tips on that, on how to do this? And speaking of locations, another thing is genital itch, which can sometimes be a challenge to use certain medications. So any safety concerns there?
Let's start with scalp. So when Dermaleve launched, when I first found out that it was on the market and started using it in some patients and saw how well it worked, first thing I did was call them and say, hey, you guys need to make a liquid for scalp. And that was actually for a personal, because my dad had a itchy spot on his scalp. Now, he had some dementia. So every time he would see me, he'd be like, you're supposed to be this big famous dermatologist and all these experts in itch. Well, what do I do about this itchy spot on my scalp? And I tried everything for years. And then, Dermaleve, fortunately, it was only one little spot. So I gave him Dermaleve cream and it worked great. Now, the problem was he would forget that the Dermaleve worked, and then he would use it for about a week, and then he would, next time I'd see him, he'd say, what are you going to give me for that itchy spot? And I would find the tube of Dermaleve and give it to him again. So I already gave you this, Dad. He'd go, oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. And then he'd use it again. But now they have come out with Dermaleve scalp serum that actually is probably even a little more effective than the cream. And that has been such a game changer for the itchy scalp patient. I know we're all used to that, especially it's usually little old ladies with the itchy scalp. And they tell you their scalp's itchy, and you look and you are desperately hoping you're going to see some redness or flaking, which makes you think that historically you're desperately looking for some redness or flaking, because then you were thinking, oh, maybe clobetasol will work, or maybe ketoconazole shampoo will work. Well, but if there was no itching or flaking, then it was a real challenge. And well, Dermaleave now has this scalp serum, and that again has been a game changer for the scalp itch. Now, the notalgia paresthetica person, right? That itchy spot. It's one of the things that's always fun with notalgia paresthetica is when the patient says, oh, I got an itchy spot on my back. Before they even lift their shirt up, I'll go around to their back and say, was it here or here? And I'll touch point at the two spots on there, where it's going to be on the point of their scapula. So how did you know that's exactly where? What? Well, there's a little nerve that kind of comes right up to the surface there, and that can get irritated, and that's where most people get these itchy spots on their back. Well, one of the challenges of getting the cream on there, Dermaleave actually has a little applicator, and it's available on Amazon, so you can get their 120-gram tube, which will be enough to last somebody for a year, and the little applicator thing, which is kind of like a little wand that's got a sponge on it. So you put the little cream on there, and then you can get it to that spot on their back. Even the elderly patients who don't have great flexibility, and to get that, the wand and the 120 grams of Dermaleave is like $45. And that then gives them an answer for their notalgia paresthetica for a year. It really is something that makes a huge difference for these people. You also mentioned, and that's another place where it's really been useful, especially the little old ladies, it tends to be the scalp. Old men tends to be the scrotum. And Dermaleave cream has been really useful for anogenital pruritus for me. And again, you stay away from getting into the trap of using a steroid on skin that's already thin, that has high systemic absorption, and can actually lead to some steroid addiction in my experience, and really no safety concerns with it. Another nice thing about Dermaleave, right? The active ingredient is aluminum acetate, which has been around forever. And we know that aluminum acetate, has some efficacy for itch, but it certainly can't just be the aluminum acetate, because if it was, we would have, had itch solved decades and decades ago. And there's some other ingredients in there that I think are really contributing to the efficacy. There's some hyaluronic acid, there's strontium, some glycerin, some ceramides. My guess is that it's probably the strontium that's the ingredient that really makes a big difference. But, the aluminum acetate is the listed active ingredient, which is an astringent that's been around for a long time. But none of these ingredients do we have any concern for either local or systemic side effects. Only thing that you've got to be a little aware of with Dermaleave is that if it's dermatitic skin, so if it's really broken down, it can really sting for about 10 seconds after you put it on. It's a pretty intense sting, but in skin that's just excoriated, I don't see really the stinging or burning. It's really only if you put it on active dermatitis that I see that. But that is really the only tolerability or safety issue with Dermaleave at all. Otherwise, it is as safe as anything could be, and something that I have plenty of patients who are putting it on 3 or 4 times a day if they've got really constant itch. They'll wake up in the morning, put it on, at 7, 8 in the morning. They'll put it on again around noon. They'll put it on again at 5 o'clock. They'll put it on again before they go to bed at night. And, you would think 4 times a day would drive people nuts. But because they get relief from the itch so quickly with it, I don't get complaints about it. It really has been something that the speed of onset of the itch relief really makes people less sort of annoyed, and really not annoyed at all about having to put it on multiple times a day.
Well, Matt, you kept your promise. You scratched all those little itches I had coming into this episode. So I truly, truly appreciate your expertise here and really beautifully taking us through this fairly common problem that's super annoying, that little itchy spot without a rash that we see in clinic at least once a day in my experience. So thank you very much for your time, for your expertise. And this is the second time we have you over. So I can't wait for the third time that we can go through some of this stuff. Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it.
You got it. I love talking about itch, and I'm going to leave you with one other thing that just is always I've loved about itch. So I'm sure you guys are both familiar with Gil Yosipovich, who is sort of the grandfather of itch,
Oh,
and
we're quite familiar. He's at Hadar's institution.
Yes, Gil.
exactly.
Gil has been an amazing teacher and mentor, at least for me, but I know for many others. Yes.
So it's two of my favorite studies he's done have been putting people in functional MRIs and then, giving them an itch. And first showed that scratching the itch yourself is more pleasurable than somebody else scratching the itch. But even more interesting was that itch is such a fascinating phenomenon because unlike pain, where pain relief, you're just taking away an unpleasant sensation. When you have itch, scratching that itch doesn't just take away the unpleasant sensation of itch, it is a very pleasurable experience. And believe it or not, if you've got a really itchy spot, when you scratch it, the same part of your brain lights up that lights up whenever you win when you're gambling, whenever if somebody is using an addictive drug, sex, the things that get people addicted to something because it feels so good. That same part of your brain gets activated whenever you scratch an itch. And that's just, that's cool. It's interesting.
Well, that explains it. I don't have a gambling addiction, but I have a mosquito bite scratching addiction. That's for sure. So,
And Matt, that's actually explaining why we're slowly developing quite of a habit of having you here. It's almost like an addiction. So thank you again. It's been not only informative, but entertaining. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
this podcast is brought to all of us by Dermalieve, who are makers of an innovative cream that is targeting those that want to address itch.